Hello again. We want to continue our studies of our gracious God. Our theme is that our God is the God of new beginnings. And it is true that you can start again with God. God can strengthen you again, cleanse you again first, strengthen you again, empower you again, and use you again. These messages are really for the 500 plus community. Now, there was such a community in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul is witnessing there to the resurrection, proofs of the resurrection. And one of the proofs was that the Lord was seen. And in that chapter, he points out that the Lord was seen by over 500 brothers at one time. We need a community like that today, in this generation. People who we're not witnesses to the resurrection, but we want to know the power of the resurrection in our lives from day to day. We want to live in fellowship with the risen Lord, and our lives to make an impact for Him and to tell for Him in this age and in this generation. And you can be part of that community. You can send a letter to us, an email or a text to say that you want to be part of this witnessing body in this generation, in this century, and we will add your name to the list. Let us know your name and where you live. What we're looking at is individuals in the Bible where God brought them to the place where they could come again, where they could start again. We began with Cain. God could say to him, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And he was invited to come again with the required sacrifice, a sacrifice dying in his place as a substitute. And that is the way of salvation. It's through Christ's death for us that we are accepted. Not only did we cover Cain and look at Cain, but we looked at Samson. And that moment too, when this man, blinded and just used for sport in the temple by the Philistines, he calls out to God, strengthen me again. And God does strengthen him. And although he loses his life, then the temple is pulled down upon all those who are there at that time. We went to Naomi. We thought of Naomi, who went off to Moab, and tragically her husband, her two sons, they die, and she's left there on her own with her two daughters-in-law. But Naomi comes home to Bethlehem. Sometimes we've got to come home again to God. Perhaps you're in that situation at the moment. So we've looked at Cain and Samson and Naomi. Today we want to consider Elijah, because again we have a situation where here's a man who was strong for God, ran away, sat down under a broom tree, said, Lord, take my life. It's better that I die. But God cares for him, and we discover in 1 Kings 19 that God recommissions him, allows him to begin again, to serve him and to work for him. And that's what we need. If we've got to the place where we have got under the broom tree, we can know that God still cares for us, and he can recommission us and reuse us again. So we're going to look at Elijah. We're going to pick up the story of Elijah really after that wonderful moment on Mount Carmel when the fire of the Lord fell and when the 400 prophets of Baal were slain. And then the moment when he tells Ahab that there's the sound of abundance of rain. He's interceding on the top of Carmel, and the rain is going to come. We pick up the story there. We find first of all here at the end of chapter 18 that the hand of the Lord was upon him. We're told here, now it happened in the meantime, verse 45, the sky was black with clouds and wind, there's a heavy rain, So Ahab rode away and went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. The hand of the Lord comes upon him and enables him to run ahead of the king, even to Jezreel itself. You know, the hand of the Lord is a phrase that's found in different parts of the scriptures. For example, in Ezra chapter 8, when the exiles are returning from Babylon, it says, the hand of the Lord was upon us to deliver us from our enemies and the ambush by the way. So the hand of the Lord enabled them. In Acts 11, verse 21, there were those Christians scattered from Jerusalem at the time of the persecution by Saul, and they're in Antioch in Acts 11, and we're told there the hand of the Lord was with them. A great number believed and turned to the Lord. The hand of the Lord in protection, strengthening, and also enduing and enabling to be a blessing to others. That's what we need. You need the Lord's hand. So do I. I need to be sure that we have his hand upon us from day to day. So the hand of the Lord was upon him. And then we discovered that the king and the queen were against him. When we enter into the opening verses of chapter 19, we're told that Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Well, he didn't tell Jezebel all, did he? There's no mention of God here at all in this report that came from Ahab. No mention at all. You know, it's just what Elijah had done as far as the prophets were concerned. You know, it is true that sometimes today God is not mentioned by many people unless they use his name as a swear word. That's how the name is used, but not in reverence or in worship or devotion. It's a very sad. You know, when the words "my God" are spoken, I often think that people should remember that they are confessing something when they're saying that. They're confessing that God is their God. He's the God to whom they are accountable, and the God that one day they must stand before, the God who wishes that they would be reconciled to him and ready to meet him. So we can say that the king and queen were against him. In fact, Jezebel says here, she sends a messenger to Elijah, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. So you'll be like the prophets that have been slain. I'm going to kill you tomorrow about this time. Now, of course, you know, it appears to be just a threat, an empty threat, because she's giving him time to 24 hours. That would not happen if this was a real attack upon Elijah. And so, but we're told here that not only the hand of the Lord was upon him and the king and queen were against him, but the situation got on top of him, because we're told here when he saw that, verse 3, he arose and ran for his life and went to Beersheba, that's 100 miles away, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there, went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. Elijah runs away. Now, you know, of course, sometimes it is, you could say, important calmly to consider your position and to move. At times Jesus did that, and even Paul, they didn't want to be exposed to unnecessary danger. But here we're not talking about a calm decision, but this is pure panic here, just pure panic, because when he rose and ran for his life, that's the situation here. The situation got on top of him. You know, this is a moment of failure, tragically, in Elijah's life, because if he had stayed with what had happened on Mount Carmel and people crying out, the Lord, he is God, not the Baal God. You know, it's possible that people could have risen up in revival, but now he runs away, and he's sitting under the broom tree. He's saying, "It's enough, Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my fathers." You know, sometimes there are things that can cause us to get into such a position of failure. Here we can see, first of all, there was hurried action. It's interesting if you go back to the earlier chapters in Elijah's story, in chapter 17 and chapter 18, because Elijah didn't move unless by the word of the Lord. You know, if you go to chapter 17, you'll read that verse in verse 2. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Get away from here, turn eastward, hide by the brook Cherith." So as the word of the Lord, he responds to the word of the Lord. A few verses down in verse 8, we're told, the word of the Lord came to him saying, "Go to Zarephath, that belongs to Sidon. Dwell there. I've commanded a widow to feed you." So, you know, it's the word of the Lord comes to him. Again, in chapter 18 and verse 1, it came to pass after many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "Go present yourself to Ahab, and I'll send rain on the earth." The word of the Lord. But there's no word of the Lord here. This is not Elijah submitting to direction from the Lord, or accepting guidance, or the Lord's leading. This is pure panic. This is a hurried decision here. Hurried action is what I've called it. Hurried action, just on his own, by his own decision. Hurried action. And then here we can also say it's fearful action. The ESV has put in the word here that he was afraid and he ran for his life. And that is true. This action was motivated by fear. You know, it's a wonderful verse in Psalm 119, verse 117, where the psalmist says, "Hold me up and I shall be safe." But there was no trusting in God here to hold him up, to keep him safe. It was not just hurried action, it was fearful action. And we could say also it was emotionally charged action. You know, Elijah had experienced many emotions over the events that happened before this time. We know all that happened on Mount Carmel with the 400 prophets and the fire of the Lord falling. And then there was that intense intercession for those days. 7 times his servant was sent to see if the rains were coming. And then there was the running to Jezreel, 18 miles, and then 100 miles to Beersheba. You know, this was really physically draining and emotionally draining on Elijah. And it's in those situations very often that we can feel. You know, it's so important we remember that in our lives from day to day, that there maybe are times when we have to know what it is to rest and to experience a time with the Lord, because it does say, of course, in Isaiah 40, verse 31, that those that wait on the Lord, that trust in him, will renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings like eagles. That's soaring up in God's grace and running and not being weary. And this is important. They shall walk and not faint. That's the daily routine of life. Every day it's important to renew your relationship with the Lord, to be in contact with God day by day, being renewed by him, and spiritually to help you. And that's what we don't see here, you know, tragically. So we have hurried action, fearful action, emotionally charged action, and self-action. It's interesting to notice that in the times when Elijah speaks here, it's "I have done this and I have done that." In verse 10, "I've been very zealous. I alone am left." And back up in the earlier verse, up in verse 4, we discover he says, "I am no better than my fathers." It's I. He's self-reliant, basically. That's being seen here. In fact, he says, "I am no better than my fathers," as if before that moment he had considered he was better than his fathers. He was the person who was standing up in the gap. He was there. He was holding back the opposition. and the idolatry that was going on. But it's not always, it's not in ourselves, it's only as we have the Lord's help. I can do nothing. The scriptures tell us that, without me, Jesus says in John 15, you can do nothing. It's important to be dependent upon the Lord from day to day. And sadly, at this moment, because of the various things we've pointed out, Elijah failed. He runs away. He's under the broom tree. He's telling the Lord, he says, Lord, it's enough. Let me die. Take my life. I'm no better than my fathers. The situation got on top of him. But I want you to see next that the Lord still cared for him. It's wonderful here to read about how under the broom tree suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And there was a cake baked on the coals. It's wonderful how the Lord provided through ravens, provided through a widow, Zarephath, in earlier chapters, and now through an angel. The provision is there for him, and he receives that provision. And then we're told he lay down again and slept. That's what he needed, just God's care, his compassion, to renew him, to renew his strength even at this time as well. God was caring for his prophet, for his servant in a very, very special way. The Lord still cared for him. Then the moment comes when the angel returns and touches him the second time and says, arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you. So the Lord still cared for him, but it is true, there was a journey ahead that could be too great for him. And we must always remember that what the Lord was really beginning to show him here was that he had still work for him to do. There was still a future. There was still ministry that God had planned for him, as we'll see in just a moment. God wasn't finished with him. God wanted to recommission him and use him still. But the journey would be too great for him unless he was dependent on the Lord's strength from day to day. That's what we need. We need that strength moment by moment, day by day. As God helps us, we can go forward in the work of God. So the journey would be too great for him. And then we discover here at the end that the Lord in grace recommissions him. Now we have to look at this carefully so we really understand what is being said here. First of all, the Lord said to him in verse 9, he said to him, because he's in this cave, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? That's very important there to see that. He's now gone to Horeb, the mountain of God. He's in the cave, and then the Lord says to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? The word here is important, as I've said. There's the word there. We find that word at times in the story of Elijah. I've commanded the ravens to feed you there. And at Zarephath, you're to go to Zarephath because there's a widow who will provide for you there. There were times when God sent him there, places where he was in the will of God. But then the Lord says, what are you doing here? This was not in my will. This is not what I had planned for you. We need to ask ourselves in our own lives, are we there where God would have us to be? Or can he say to us, what are you doing here? What are you doing in this condition, in this present situation? And that's what happened here to Elijah. And so he goes out onto the top of the mountain. And we're told here in verse 11 that the Lord passed by, and there was a great wind that tore the mountains and broke the rocks. The wind came. But we're told here in this verse, the Lord was not in the wind. And then after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And then after the fire, a still small voice. Now, what can that all mean? The wind, the earthquake, and the fire. I believe that you should relate that to a couple of verses that are further down the chapter here, because what the Lord is saying to Elijah, that I'm still in control of the situation. I'm serving and my plans are still being worked out here. Because when you go further down the chapter, you see the Lord is still in control. He says to Elijah in verse 15, "Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." And then he says, "When you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria, and Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat you shall anoint as prophet in your place." So 3 people are going to be anointed. And this is the important point here. These people were being used in the judgment of the Lord at that time upon the people, because it continues, "It shall be that whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill, and whoever escapes the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill." So God is still in control, and he says, "I'm still going to pour out my judgments." You know, you must realize that my plans are still being carried out here. You're not the only one. You know, I'm still at work here. So he is encouraging Elijah to realize that he is still in control, and everything is not falling apart as Elijah thought it was, because God is still working and fulfilling his purposes. And then the moment comes, you know, when Elijah hears the still small voice. And when he hears this, he goes out and stands at the entrance of the cave. He wraps his face. It's amazing this. We remember the cherubim with 2 wings, they cover their feet and so on, and 2 they cover their faces. It's a sense of reverence and devotion, and Elijah does this. He's responding now to what he is, how the love of God, his compassion for him, and the sense that he's still in control. And he goes out, and again the voice comes and says, "What are you doing here, Elijah? I want you somewhere else." And the moment comes in verse 15 when the Lord says to him, "Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." So God recommissions him and sends him on this mission. And of course, Elisha is going to be brought into place here as a prophet after Elijah. But it does say that Elisha followed in Elijah. This is down in the last verse in the chapter, in verse 21. He didn't replace him, but he was there to help him, to follow him as his servant, as his helper. But here's the moment when God recommissions Elijah, his servant sitting under the broom tree who wanted to die. He's now been told, "Go return on your way. There's a work for you to do. There's a ministry for you to fulfill." You know, you may have become discouraged. You may have failed some reason in your life, something has happened. But you know, God still cares for you. God is a God of compassion. He cares for his servants. And you know, he still has a plan for you, a place for you, as he had for Elijah here, a ministry for you to fulfill. And he can start you again. He can recommission you again. He can send you again, just as he sent Elijah. And that's where you need to get to today, to the place where you are willing to be part of what God is doing in these days in our generation. And you can be, and God can still use you again. He loved you. He sent his son to die for you, but in your ministry, he has loved you and supported you and provided for you. And he wants you still to go on with him. Turn to him again. Come to him. Just like Elijah, show your devotion to him. Confess your failure to him and ask him to take you again and use you again for the days that are yet to come. What a plan he still has for your life. How he can still use you, just as here in this case, he recommissioned Elijah. May God bless you and use you in days to come for his glory.